The human mind is often described as the most successful product of evolution, yet it was never designed to understand the world it now lives in. Our thoughts evolved to survive short lives, immediate danger, and simple choices, not endless information, abstract time, or a future stretching decades ahead. What we call intelligence may be nothing more than a tool used far beyond its limits, and the discomfort we feel every day might not be a personal failure, but a structural one, built into the design itself. So the question is not why the human mind struggles today, but why evolution allowed it to work this way in the first place. The idea that the human mind is a failed design does not mean it is weak or defective. It means it was built for a purpose that no longer matches the world it must now navigate. To understand this mismatch, we have to step back far before modern society, before cities, writing, or long lives. The human brain emerged in environments where survival depended on immediate perception, fast reaction, and simple cause and effect. Food was scarce, danger was visible, and the future rarely extended beyond the next season. In that context, a mind that reacted quickly and focused narrowly was not a flaw. It was an advantage. Evolution does not design for truth, comfort, or long-term understanding. It selects for what works well enough to pass genes to the next generation. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the human mind became extremely good at detecting threats, remembering danger, and responding emotionally to uncertainty. What it did not evolve to do was hold large amounts of abstract information, imagine distant futures, or constantly evaluate itself. The problem begins when we place this ancient system into a world it was never shaped to interpret. Today, the mind is surrounded by symbols instead of direct experiences, by probabilities instead of visible threats, and by timelines that stretch decades into the future. The same mechanisms that once helped a human survive a predator now react to imagined scenarios, social comparisons, and unresolved questions that have no immediate resolution. This is not because the mind is malfunctioning, but because it is operating exactly as it was shaped to operate. The failure, if it can be called that, lies in the assumption that a system optimized for short-term survival should also be capable of long-term psychological balance. From an evolutionary perspective, there was no reason to refine such balance. Most humans did not live long enough for chronic anxiety, existential doubt, or prolonged dissatisfaction to reduce reproductive success. Natural selection had no incentive to smooth those edges. As a result, the modern human carries a mind that constantly scans for problems, even when none are physically present. It fills silence with thought, uncertainty with worry, and time with reflection that often leads nowhere. This tendency feels personal, as if it reflects individual weakness, but it is structural. The brain does not ask whether a thought is useful for peace or clarity. It only asks whether it might signal danger or opportunity. In the modern world, it produces a constant background tension that many people interpret as failure of character or discipline, but when viewed through the lens of human origins, this tension becomes understandable. The mind is not broken. It is simply out of context. It continues to apply ancient rules to a reality that no longer follows them. And this mismatch is the starting point for understanding why so much of human mental suffering feels persistent, vague, and difficult to resolve. When we say the human mind is a failed design, it is important to clarify what kind of failure this really is. In engineering, a failure happens when a tool is used outside the conditions it was built for. A stone axe fails in a modern factory not because it is poorly made, but because the environment has changed. The same logic applies to the human mind. Its structure reflects the pressures of a world that no longer exists. For most of human history, the mind was shaped by environments that were stable over long periods of time. Landscapes changed slowly. Social groups were small and familiar. The number of meaningful decisions a person faced in a day was limited. Under these conditions, the brain developed strategies that favored efficiency over accuracy, speed over depth, and familiarity over exploration. These strategies reduced cognitive effort and conserved energy, which was critical when calories were scarce. The mind learned to rely on shortcuts, emotional signals, and pattern recognition instead of careful analysis. These shortcuts worked because the world was repetitive and predictable at a small scale. Today, those same mental shortcuts operate in a radically different context. The modern environment is dense with information, constantly changing, and largely symbolic. The mind must process numbers, texts, images, and abstract rules that have no direct physical reference. Yet the brain still interprets these signals using systems originally meant for tracking movement, recognizing faces, and anticipating immediate danger. This creates a persistent sense of overload. The mind is not equipped to remain calm under continuous stimulation because it never needed to be. In ancestral environments, periods of intense alertness were followed by long stretches of rest. Modern life removes those stretches. Notifications, obligations, and unresolved tasks keep attention in a semi-alert state for hours or days at a time. From a biological perspective, this state is abnormal. Stress responses that were designed to activate briefly now remain partially engaged without a clear endpoint. The mind interprets this as a problem that must be solved, but many modern stressors have no clear solution. They are ongoing conditions rather than immediate threats. The brain revisits the same concerns repeatedly, not because they are meaningful, but because unresolved signals keep triggering ancient alert systems. This repetition is often mistaken for reflection or planning, but it rarely leads to action. Instead, it consumes mental energy and deepens fatigue. Importantly, evolution never corrected this tendency because it did not interfere with survival in the environments where the mind evolved. A person could worry excessively, ruminate, or feel restless and still reproduce successfully. There was no selective pressure to remove these traits. Over time, they became part of the normal human mental profile. What feels like failure today is, in fact, a legacy of past success. The mind did exactly what it needed to do for most of human history. It responded intensely to uncertainty, stayed alert to potential danger, and favored immediate relevance over long-term coherence. The cost of this design only becomes visible when humans live long lives in complex societies. The mind begins to show its limits not because it is weak, but because it is being asked to perform tasks it was never refined to handle. Understanding this reframes mental discomfort. It shifts the question from "what is wrong with me?" to "what is this system reacting to?" This shift does not remove discomfort, but it places it in a broader human context. It reminds us that the structure of the mind reflects ancient priorities, not modern expectations. By this point, it becomes clear that calling the human mind a failed design is not an accusation, but a description of limits. Every biological system carries limits shaped by the conditions under which it evolved. The human mind is no exception. What makes these limits difficult to accept is that they operate invisibly. Unlike physical weakness or injury, cognitive constraints feel like personal shortcomings. When the mind struggles to stay focused, to remain calm, or to find lasting satisfaction, the experience feels internal and individual. Yet these struggles arise from structural features shared by all humans. One of the most important of these features is the mind's reliance on prediction. The human brain constantly attempts to anticipate what will happen next. In ancestral environments, prediction was a survival tool. Anticipating the movement of animals, the behavior of rivals, or changes in weather increased the chances of staying alive. Prediction worked best when the future closely resembled the past. Small variations occurred, but the underlying patterns remained stable. In such a world, prediction reduced uncertainty and conserved energy. In the modern world, prediction becomes unstable. The pace of change is faster than the brain's ability to update its internal models. Social norms shift, technologies evolve, and long-term consequences become harder to trace. The mind continues to predict, but its predictions are often wrong or incomplete. This generates a constant sense of unease. The brain interprets prediction error as a signal that something is wrong. It responds by increasing attention, analysis, and mental effort. The mind is trapped in a cycle of anticipating outcomes it cannot accurately foresee, then reacting to the mismatch between expectation and reality. Another structural limitation lies in how the mind assigns importance. The brain evolved to prioritize information that carried immediate relevance for survival. Emotional intensity was the marker of importance. Fear, anger, and desire signaled situations that required action. In a modern environment, emotional signals are triggered by abstract events, news headlines, social evaluation, imagined futures. The brain treats these signals as urgent, even when no action is possible. This leads to a sense of constant urgency without resolution. The mind feels busy but ineffective, alert but unfulfilled. Importantly, the brain has no built-in mechanism to recognize when its responses are no longer useful. It cannot distinguish between a threat that can be confronted and a condition that must simply be endured. From an evolutionary perspective, endurance was not a priority. Short-term response was. This leaves modern humans with a mind that reacts strongly but struggles to settle. Over long periods, this imbalance becomes more noticeable. Living longer exposes the cumulative effects of a system that was never optimized for sustained psychological equilibrium. The longer the lifespan, the more opportunities there are for unresolved stress, lingering memory, and repeated prediction errors to accumulate. This is where the sense of failure becomes most visible. Not because the mind stops working, but because it works continuously without a clear stopping point. Understanding these limits does not offer a solution in the traditional sense. There is no way to redesign the brain from within a single lifetime. But recognizing the nature of these constraints changes how mental experience is interpreted. It shifts attention away from self-blame and toward context. The discomfort many people feel is not a signal of personal inadequacy. It is a reflection of how an ancient system behaves in an unfamiliar environment. This realization marks the end of the first axis. It does not answer the central question of why the human mind is this way. It only establishes the conditions under which the question becomes meaningful. To understand why the human mind struggles in a long life, we need to examine a simple but often overlooked fact. The mind evolved in bodies that rarely lived long enough to experience prolonged psychological strain. For most of human history, reaching the age that many consider middle age today was uncommon. Injury, infection, food scarcity, and environmental hazards limited lifespan. Under these conditions, the mind did not need to sustain balance over decades. Its task was immediate survival, reproduction, and short-term adaptation. It was shaped to function intensely for a relatively brief period, not steadily across a long arc of time. Emotional systems evolved to respond quickly and forcefully, pushing the body into action when necessary. Once the situation passed, the system would reset. There was no evolutionary advantage in maintaining low-level distress for years, because the future itself was uncertain and often short. Modern humans, however, live in a radically different temporal landscape. Many now expect to live for several decades beyond the age at which our ancestors would have already passed on. This extension of life did not come with a parallel extension of mental design. The brain did not evolve new structures to manage long-term uncertainty, delayed meaning, or sustained self-reflection. Instead, it continues to operate using mechanisms optimized for short horizons. This mismatch becomes more visible as life extends. Early in adulthood, the mind's intensity can feel like energy or motivation. Over time, the same intensity begins to feel like pressure. Thoughts repeat, worries linger. Emotional reactions last longer than the situations that triggered them. The mind remains active, but the environment no longer provides clear signals for resolution. From an evolutionary perspective, this prolonged mental activation is unusual. The brain's stress systems were meant to activate briefly and then stand down. Long life stretches these systems beyond their original range. What was once a short burst of vigilance becomes a background state. This does not mean the brain is malfunctioning. It means it is doing what it has always done, but for far longer than intended. Another consequence of long life is the accumulation of experience. The mind was not designed to carry decades of unresolved emotional material. Memory systems evolved to retain information that improved immediate survival, not to archive an entire personal history. As years pass, memories accumulate faster than they can be integrated. The mind holds losses, regrets, unfinished narratives, and imagined alternatives. None of these directly threaten survival, yet the brain treats them as relevant because they are emotionally charged. In a short life, such accumulation would have been limited. In a long life, it becomes unavoidable. This accumulation changes how the mind experiences time. The future no longer feels open and undefined. It becomes weighted by the past. The present becomes crowded with reference points, comparisons, and expectations. The mind, still operating with ancient rules, struggles to prioritize. It cannot easily decide which memories matter and which can fade. This creates a sense of mental heaviness that increases with age, even when physical needs are met. Importantly, evolution never selected against this outcome. A mind that became burdened later in life did not reduce reproductive success. There was no penalty for mental fatigue after childbearing years. As a result, the design remained unchanged. Long life exposes these limits not because humans have failed, but because the context has shifted. The mind was built for intensity over a short span. Living longer reveals what happens when that intensity has nowhere to go. As human life extends, the structure of the mind reveals another limitation. It has no natural sense of completion. In ancestral environments, life unfolded with a clear sequence. Childhood led quickly into adulthood, followed by reproduction and gradual physical decline. There was little time for prolonged reflection on purpose or direction. Survival itself provided structure. Tasks were concrete, roles were defined, and the end of life often arrived before questions about meaning became dominant. The modern extension of lifespan disrupts this sequence. Humans now experience long periods in which basic survival is relatively secure, yet no new biological framework exists to guide the mind through these extended phases. The brain continues to search for signals that once indicated progress or resolution, but those signals are often absent. This creates a sense of suspension, as if life is ongoing without a clear endpoint or narrative closure. The mind reacts to this suspension by increasing internal activity. Thoughts turn inward. The brain begins to evaluate itself, asking whether time is being used correctly or whether something essential has been missed. This self-evaluation feels rational, but it is driven by systems that were never meant to operate continuously. In short lives, self-assessment occurred only when necessary. In long lives, the mind turns into both the observer and the object of observation, a feedback loop that can persist for years. This loop consumes attention and amplifies dissatisfaction, even when external conditions are stable. Another consequence of extended lifespan is the delayed feedback between action and outcome. In ancestral contexts, decisions produced results quickly. A successful hunt led to food. A mistake led to injury or loss. The mind learned efficiently because cause and effect were closely linked. Modern life separates action from consequence. Effort may not produce visible results for months or years. The brain, still expecting rapid feedback, interprets this delay as uncertainty. Uncertainty keeps alert systems active. The mind continues to monitor, reassess, and question, unable to settle into rest. Over time, this persistent monitoring becomes mentally exhausting. It is not a failure of discipline or resilience. It is a response to an environment where the rules of learning have changed faster than biology can adapt. Long life also exposes the mind to repeated transitions without clear biological markers. In the past, physical decline signaled a shift toward the end of life. Today, medical and social advances delay these signals. The mind remains active and capable, while the body changes slowly. This creates ambiguity. The brain does not know when to reduce effort or release long-term goals. It continues to operate as if there is always more time to prepare, to optimize, or to improve. This perpetual preparation keeps mental systems engaged without resolution. From an evolutionary standpoint, there was no need to design a mind that knew when to stop striving. Most humans did not live long enough for this question to matter. As a result, the modern human experiences a prolonged middle state, not struggling to survive, but not biologically guided toward rest. This state did not exist in the environment where the mind evolved. The discomfort it produces is often interpreted as personal confusion or failure, yet it reflects a structural absence. There is no evolutionary script for how a mind should feel across many decades of relative safety. The brain continues to apply short-life logic to long-life conditions. It searches for urgency, meaning, and closure where none are clearly defined. This mismatch deepens with time, not because the mind deteriorates, but because it remains active in a context that offers no natural stopping point. Recognizing this helps explain why long life often brings not only wisdom, but also a quiet sense of restlessness that has no obvious cause. The final limitation revealed by long human life is not exhaustion of the mind, but its inability to adapt its rhythm. The brain does not naturally slow itself down with age in the way the body does. Muscles weaken, reaction time decreases, and physical systems gradually reduce their demands. The mind, however, continues to operate with similar intensity unless forced to stop by illness or fatigue. This asymmetry creates tension. The body signals the need for rest and conservation, while the mind continues to generate plans, expectations, and unresolved questions. In ancestral environments, this mismatch rarely persisted. Physical decline often coincided with the end of life, limiting the duration of this imbalance. In modern life, the imbalance can last for decades. The mind remains active long after its original evolutionary role has been fulfilled. This persistent activity is not directed toward survival, but toward optimization. The brain continues to evaluate choices, imagine alternatives, and replay past decisions. These processes were useful when decisions carried immediate consequences. In a long life, many decisions lose their urgency, yet the mind treats them as if they still matter. This creates a background noise of mental activity that does not lead to action or resolution. Over time, this noise becomes familiar, almost invisible, yet it shapes how life is experienced. Many people come to accept constant mental activity as normal, even when it interferes with rest, attention, and emotional balance. From a biological perspective, this state is unusual. The brain evolved in cycles of engagement and disengagement. Periods of intense focus were followed by periods of rest, enforced by the environment. Darkness, physical fatigue, and limited stimulation naturally reduced mental activity. Modern environments remove these constraints. Artificial light extends the day. Information remains available at all times. The mind receives no clear signal to disengage. As a result, mental systems that were once episodic become continuous. The brain does not recognize this continuity as a problem. It simply responds to available input. Another aspect of this design limitation is the mind's resistance to final answers. The brain evolved to remain flexible, ready to update beliefs when new information appeared. This openness was adaptive in uncertain environments. In long lives with complex information, it prevents closure. Questions remain open, narratives remain unfinished, and satisfaction remains temporary. The mind moves from one concern to the next, Rarely settling, this restlessness is often interpreted as curiosity or ambition, but it can also become a source of fatigue. The brain has no internal mechanism to declare a life phase complete. It continues to search for improvement, understanding, or correction, even when such efforts no longer change outcomes. Evolution did not remove this tendency because it did not interfere with reproduction. A mind that continued to seek answers late in life did not reduce the chances of passing on genes. Therefore, the design remained unchanged. Long life simply makes this tendency more visible. The sense that the mind cannot rest, even when external demands are low, is not a modern weakness. It is an ancient feature exposed by extended time. This realization completes the second axis. It shows that living longer does not merely add years to life. It places a system designed for short, intense use into a prolonged state of activity. The resulting discomfort is not an error to be fixed, but a consequence to be understood. Long life reveals the mind's original rhythm and how far modern existence has pushed it beyond its intended range. Memory is often treated as one of the greatest strengths of the human mind. It allows learning, continuity, and identity. In its original evolutionary role, memory served a narrow and practical purpose: to help organisms avoid danger and repeat actions that led to survival. Early human memory systems prioritized emotionally charged events, especially those involving threat, loss, or reward. Remembering where danger occurred, who could be trusted, or which paths led to food increased the chances of staying alive. These memories were meant to guide behavior in the near future, not to be carried indefinitely. The mind did not evolve to store a detailed record of an entire life. In ancestral environments, the volume of relevant experience was limited. Life unfolded within a small geographic range, a stable social group, and a narrow set of recurring challenges. Under these conditions, memory remained manageable. Events repeated themselves, allowing old memories to be reinforced or replaced naturally. There was little need to retain distant or abstract experiences that no longer affected survival. As a result, the brain developed a bias toward retaining what felt important, not what was objectively accurate or useful over long periods. Emotional intensity became the filter through which memory was encoded. This system worked well when emotional signals aligned closely with real threats and opportunities. In the modern world, this alignment breaks down. The human mind is exposed to an unprecedented number of emotionally stimulating events that do not require action. News, social information, imagined futures, and personal narratives all trigger emotional responses. The brain encodes these experiences using the same mechanisms it once reserved for survival-critical events. Memory begins to accumulate beyond its original function. Instead of guiding immediate behavior, it becomes a storehouse of unresolved impressions. The mind holds on to past conversations, mistakes, losses, and hypothetical outcomes. Many of these memories no longer serve a practical purpose, yet they remain accessible because they are emotionally charged. This accumulation creates weight. The mind revisits old material not because it is useful, but because it remains marked as important. In a short life, the accumulation of such material would have been limited. In a long life, it becomes unavoidable. The brain lacks an efficient mechanism for clearing emotionally tagged memories that no longer influence survival. Forgetting was never selected as a priority when survival depended on remembering danger. As a result, memory systems favor retention over release. This bias becomes problematic when the environment no longer provides clear resolution for emotional experiences. Many modern events do not end decisively. Relationships fade rather than conclude. Efforts produce ambiguous outcomes. Losses lack clear meaning. The brain records these experiences without closure. Memory remains active, searching for patterns or lessons that may not exist. This search is often mistaken for reflection or learning, but it rarely leads to resolution. Instead, It reinforces the sense that the past is unfinished. Over time, this unfinished quality becomes a persistent background state. The present moment is experienced through layers of memory, comparison, and expectation. The mind struggles to remain grounded because it is constantly referencing stored material. This is not a sign of weakness or rumination by choice. It reflects the original design of memory as a survival tool rather than a tool for peace or clarity. Understanding this reframes the role of memory in human mental life. It reveals that much of what feels like mental burden is the result of a system performing beyond its intended scope. Memory was built to protect life in the short term. Living long exposes what happens when that protection never fully disengages. As memory accumulates, the human mind begins to treat the past as a space that must be continually revisited. This tendency is not deliberate. It emerges from how memory and attention are linked. In the brain, emotionally marked memories remain connected to alert systems. When attention is not fully occupied by immediate tasks, it naturally drifts toward these unresolved signals. In ancestral environments, this drift was useful. Revisiting a dangerous encounter or a failed attempt could improve future behavior. The past was reviewed in order to refine action. Once the lesson was learned, similar situations would arise again, allowing memory to update and eventually settle. In modern life, many situations never repeat in the same way. Social interactions, personal decisions, and abstract problems rarely offer clear feedback. The brain continues to revisit these memories, expecting new insight, but the environment provides no resolution. This creates a loop. Memory feeds attention, attention reinforces memory, and the mind remains anchored to events that can no longer be changed. Over time, this looping becomes automatic. The brain does not distinguish between useful review and repetitive replay. Both feel like thinking. Both consume mental resources. Another consequence of this design is the mind's difficulty with letting go. Letting go implies that a memory no longer carries relevance. For a system shaped by survival, releasing emotionally charged information was risky. As a result, the brain errs on the side of retention. It keeps memories accessible long after their practical value has expired. In a stable environment, this conservatism was adaptive. In a complex and rapidly changing environment, it becomes a source of mental congestion. The mind carries layers of past experiences that overlap, contradict, and compete for attention. This congestion affects how new experiences are processed. The brain compares the present to stored material, often unconsciously. Similarities trigger emotional responses, even when the situations are fundamentally different. A neutral event can awaken old memories, bringing with it emotional reactions that do not fit the current context. The individual experiences this as overreaction or sensitivity without realizing that the response is rooted in how memory generalizes. This generalization was useful when the cost of missing a threat was high. In modern life, it produces false alarms. Memory also shapes identity. Humans construct a sense of self by linking past experiences into a narrative. This narrative provides continuity, but it also fixes attention on what has already happened. The brain was not designed to constantly evaluate identity. In ancestral settings, identity was defined by role and group membership. There was little need for internal storytelling. Long life and social complexity change this. The mind now spends significant time reviewing who it has been, what it has done, and what it might become. Memory supplies the material for this evaluation, but it does not organize it for well-being. It simply provides emotionally salient fragments. The result is a narrative that often emphasizes loss, regret, or missed opportunity, because these carry strong emotional markers. Positive experiences fade more quickly because they signal safety rather than urgency. This imbalance gives memory a negative weight over time. It is not that life contains more negative events, but that the brain prioritizes them differently. Evolution favored this bias because it reduced risk. In long lives, it skews perception. The past feels heavier than the present, even when conditions are stable. This weight influences mood, attention, and expectation without conscious intent. Understanding this mechanism reveals why memory can feel intrusive rather than supportive. It is not malfunctioning. It is applying ancient priorities to a life that no longer revolves around immediate survival. The mind continues to scan the past for lessons, even when there are none left to extract. The final consequence of this memory system is not simply that the past remains present, but that it quietly reshapes how the future is imagined. The human mind does not approach the future as an open field. It constructs expectations by extending patterns stored in memory. In ancestral environments, this approach was efficient. The future closely resembled the past, so projecting forward based on prior experience increased survival. If a season had been harsh before, preparing for hardship made sense. If a rival group had acted aggressively, caution was justified. The future was short, familiar, and constrained. In modern life, the future is abstract, distant, and uncertain in ways the mind cannot easily model. Yet the brain continues to rely on memory as its primary guide. It uses past outcomes, especially emotionally charged ones, to estimate what might happen next. This leads to a future that feels narrower than it actually is. Possibilities are filtered through what has already occurred. The mind becomes cautious not because danger is imminent, but because memory signals risk. This mechanism was never designed to support long-term openness or psychological renewal. It was designed to reduce error in the short term. Over long spans of time, this conservative bias accumulates. The future begins to feel repetitive, even when circumstances are changing. People often describe this as feeling stuck or stagnant, without understanding that the sensation originates in how memory constrains projection. The brain assumes continuity where none is guaranteed. Another limitation emerges in how memory interacts with learning. The mind learns best when feedback is clear and timely. In modern life, feedback is often delayed, ambiguous, or absent. Memory records effort without outcome, intention without result. These incomplete records distort learning. The brain cannot easily update its models, so it continues to rely on outdated assumptions. This creates a gap between experience and expectation that persists over time. The mind attempts to resolve this gap by revisiting the past, searching for missed information. When none is found, the loop continues. It unfolds quietly, shaping mood and attention. Over time, the mind becomes oriented toward preservation rather than exploration. Memory emphasizes what went wrong more than what could go right. This orientation once reduced risk. In a long life, it reduces vitality. Importantly, the brain has no internal signal to indicate when this bias becomes counterproductive. It cannot recognize that the environment has changed enough to warrant a different strategy. Evolution did not provide such a signal because environments rarely change so dramatically within a single lifetime. Long modern lives expose this absence. The mind continues to behave as if stability depends on remembering and caution, even when adaptation would require flexibility and release. This does not mean that memory is an enemy. It remains essential for learning, identity, and continuity. But its design priorities become visible only when its original context is removed. Memory was not built to support prolonged psychological comfort. It was built to protect against loss. When loss becomes abstract, symbolic, or imagined, memory continues to respond as if it were real. This leads to a quiet tension between what the mind anticipates and what the present actually demands. Understanding this tension completes the third axis. It shows that memory, while indispensable, carries an inherent bias that shapes both how the past is held and how the future is approached. The weight people feel is not the result of personal failure or weakness. It is the natural outcome of a system optimized for survival being asked to guide a life that extends far beyond its original design limits. One of the most subtle design limitations of the human mind is its inability to clearly separate thought from reality. From an evolutionary perspective, this limitation makes sense. Early humans lived in environments where imagining a threat and encountering a threat often required the same response. If a sound suggested the presence of a predator, hesitation could be fatal. The brain evolved to treat internally generated signals with seriousness, especially when they carried emotional weight. A thought that indicated danger triggered physiological readiness, even before the danger was confirmed. This overlap between imagination and perception increased survival. It reduced the cost of being wrong in one direction. Reacting to a threat that did not exist was safer than ignoring one that did. In this context, the boundary between thought and reality did not need to be precise. The cost of false alarms was low compared to the cost of missed threats. In modern life, this ancient strategy remains intact. The human brain still responds to thoughts as if they were meaningful signals from the environment. An imagined future event can activate the same emotional and physiological systems as a real one. A remembered mistake can produce the same stress response as an immediate failure. The body reacts before the mind has time to evaluate whether action is necessary. This design was never corrected because it continued to serve survival in ancestral settings. The modern world, however, presents a different challenge. Many of the most emotionally charged events humans encounter today exist only as thoughts. Financial concerns, social judgment, and long-term uncertainty are largely symbolic. They do not require immediate physical response, yet the brain treats them as urgent. The mind feels under threat, while the body has nowhere to direct its energy. Over time, this mismatch becomes exhausting. The brain does not distinguish between thinking about a problem and being inside it. This fusion explains why people often feel overwhelmed by situations that have not yet occurred or may never occur at all. The mind constructs scenarios, and the body responds as if they are real. This is not imagination malfunctioning. It is imagination functioning, as it always has, within a context that no longer matches its original purpose. Another consequence of this design is the difficulty of disengaging from thought. Because the brain treats thought as potentially relevant, it resists shutting it down. Silence becomes uncomfortable. When external stimulation decreases, internal activity increases. The mind fills the space with scenarios, evaluations, and rehearsals. In ancestral environments, quiet moments were opportunities to scan for danger. Internal vigilance served a purpose. In modern environments, quiet moments often occur in safe settings, yet the brain does not receive a clear signal that vigilance is unnecessary. It continues to generate content, interpreting the absence of input as uncertainty rather than safety. This contributes to difficulty resting. When external demands fade, the mind becomes louder. This is not because the brain prefers noise, but because it was never designed to experience prolonged safety without clear environmental cues. Darkness once meant vulnerability. Stillness meant exposure. The brain learned to stay alert. Modern safety removes physical danger but leaves cognitive systems unchanged. Understanding this helps explain why the human mind struggles to distinguish between thinking and experiencing. It was never meant to draw a sharp line between the two. Treating thoughts as real was once adaptive. In a world dominated by abstract concerns, it becomes a source of continuous internal pressure. This realization opens the next layer of the failed design. The problem is not that humans think too much, but that thinking itself activates systems meant for direct interaction with reality. It lacks a natural mechanism for scaling emotional response to the actual level of danger. In ancestral environments, most threats were binary. A predator was either present or not. An injury either required immediate action or it did not. Under these conditions, strong emotional reactions were efficient. They mobilized the body quickly and decisively. The brain did not need fine-grained calibration. Intensity itself was adaptive. In modern life, threats are rarely binary. They exist on a spectrum of possibility, probability, and delay. Financial instability, social rejection, and future uncertainty are not immediate dangers, yet they carry emotional weight. The brain responds to these signals using systems designed for urgent physical threats. This produces emotional responses that feel disproportionate to the situation. The mind reacts strongly even when no immediate action is possible or required. From the inside, this feels like overreaction or lack of control. From an evolutionary perspective, it is simply an old system applying simple rules to complex inputs. The brain does not ask whether an emotional response is reasonable in a social or long-term sense. It asks whether the signal might indicate risk. If the answer is unclear, it errs on the side of intensity. This bias toward intensity once reduced the chance of fatal mistakes. In modern contexts, it leads to chronic emotional activation. The mind remains engaged, scanning for resolution that does not arrive. Another consequence of this design is the difficulty the brain has with uncertainty. Uncertainty was dangerous in ancestral settings. Not knowing whether a predator was nearby increased vulnerability. As a result, the brain evolved to treat uncertainty itself as a problem. It responds by generating scenarios, predictions, and internal simulations. These simulations are attempts to reduce uncertainty by filling in missing information. In a complex world, however, uncertainty is unavoidable. Many situations cannot be resolved through prediction alone. The mind continues to simulate, producing increasingly elaborate scenarios. Each scenario triggers emotional responses as if it were real. This amplifies stress without improving clarity. The brain becomes trapped in a cycle of simulation and reaction. Importantly, the brain does not recognize this cycle as unproductive. It interprets continued simulation as effort towards safety. Stopping would feel irresponsible. This explains why people often struggle to quiet their minds, even when they understand intellectually that worrying will not help. The drive to simulate is not conscious. It is a deeply rooted response to ambiguity. Another limitation appears in how the mind responds to social signals. For early humans, social exclusion could mean death. Belonging to a group was essential for survival. The brain evolved to treat social evaluation as highly significant. In modern societies, social feedback is constant and abstract. Likes, opinions, and comparisons carry emotional signals without immediate consequences. The brain responds to these signals with the same seriousness it once reserved for threats to survival. Thought about how one is perceived activates the same systems as physical danger. This creates a continuous internal monitoring of social standing. The mind becomes preoccupied with imagined judgment, even in the absence of real consequences. This monitoring is exhausting, but the brain cannot easily disengage from it. It treats social uncertainty as unresolved risk. These mechanisms together explain why thinking can feel dangerous rather than neutral. Thought triggers emotional systems. Emotional systems demand resolution, and resolution remains unavailable. The mind does not fail because it is weak. It fails because it cannot adjust the intensity of its responses to match the abstract nature of modern threats. This mismatch deepens the sense that the mind is constantly under pressure, even in moments of physical safety. Recognizing this pattern reveals that much mental distress arises not from events themselves, but from how the brain interprets and reacts to signals that exist primarily in thought. The deepest consequence of the mind's inability to separate thought from reality is not constant fear, but constant self-engagement. The brain becomes occupied not only with external situations, but with its own activity. Thoughts are observed, evaluated, questioned, and often resisted. This creates a second layer of experience where the mind reacts to itself. From an evolutionary perspective, this self-monitoring was limited. Early humans needed awareness of their environment, not continuous awareness of their inner states. There was little advantage in analyzing one's own thoughts or emotions. Action mattered more than interpretation. In modern life, however, the environment encourages introspection. Language, culture, and education emphasize self-awareness. The mind turns inward, using thought to evaluate thought. This recursive process has no natural stopping point. Each observation generates another layer of response. A thought produces an emotion. The emotion becomes another object of thought. The mind reacts again. This loop can continue indefinitely. The brain treats this internal activity as meaningful because it carries emotional signals. Yet it rarely leads to resolution. Instead, it amplifies the sense of mental busyness. The mind feels active even when nothing external is happening. This activity is often mistaken for productivity or insight, but it primarily reflects the brain's inability to disengage from internally generated stimuli. Another limitation emerges in how the mind interprets control. The brain evolved to influence the environment through direct action. If a situation could be changed, acting on it reduced stress. When action was impossible, stress remained until conditions changed. Modern thought creates the illusion of control without action. The mind simulates outcomes, plans responses, and rehearses conversations. These simulations feel like effort, but they do not alter reality. The brain, however, does not fully register this difference. It interprets simulation as engagement. This keeps stress systems partially active, waiting for resolution that never comes. The result is a state of constant readiness without release. Over time, this state becomes familiar. Many people come to identify with their thoughts, assuming that mental activity reflects who they are. The boundary between the observer and the observed dissolves. Thoughts are experienced as facts. Feelings are experienced as truths. This fusion intensifies suffering because the mind cannot step back from its own content. In ancestral environments, such fusion was less problematic. Thoughts were closely tied to immediate conditions. Modern thought often has no direct reference point. The brain reacts anyway. This reveals a core aspect of the failed design. The mind was never meant to be a self-contained environment. It evolved to interact with the world, not to inhabit its own simulations. When the external world becomes safer and less demanding, internal activity fills the gap. The brain does not interpret safety as a signal to rest. It interprets it as an opportunity to process unresolved information. This processing has no clear end because many modern concerns cannot be resolved through action. As a result, the mind remains engaged with itself, generating pressure without direction. This does not mean that awareness or reflection are harmful. They are powerful tools, but without natural limits, they become burdens. The brain lacks an internal mechanism to distinguish between useful reflection and endless self-monitoring. Evolution did not provide such a mechanism because the problem did not exist in ancestral contexts. Understanding this completes the fourth axis. It shows that much of human mental strain arises not from external hardship, but from the mind turning inward without guidance. The inability to separate thought from reality leads to a world where the most persistent pressure comes from within. This prepares the ground for the next axis, where we examine how abstract thinking, once a rare advantage, became a constant source of internal tension. Abstract thinking is often celebrated as the defining feature of human intelligence. It allows humans to imagine possibilities beyond the present moment, to plan far into the future, and to construct systems that extend far beyond individual experience. Yet this ability did not emerge as a central design goal of the human mind. It arose as a byproduct of other cognitive functions that supported survival. These skills gradually combined into a capacity for abstraction, but this capacity remained limited and situational for most of human history. Abstract thought was used when necessary, not continuously. The environment constrained it. There were few symbols, few long-term plans, and little incentive to imagine distant futures. In modern life, abstraction becomes constant. Humans interact more with symbols than with direct experience. Numbers, schedules, narratives, and imagined outcomes dominate daily thought. The mind is required to operate in layers far removed from physical reality. This shift exposes a fundamental limitation. The brain did not evolve to sustain abstract thinking indefinitely. Abstraction is mentally expensive. It requires holding information in mind without immediate sensory reference. In ancestral contexts, such effort was rare and brief. The brain engages systems designed for short bursts of inference and keeps them active for hours. This creates fatigue that is not physical, but cognitive. The mind feels tired even when the body is still. Another cost of abstraction lies in how it amplifies uncertainty. Concrete situations provide clear feedback. An action produces an observable result. Abstract situations delay or obscure feedback. Plans extend into the future. Outcomes depend on variables beyond direct control. The brain continues to simulate possibilities, attempting to reduce uncertainty through thought. These simulations activate emotional systems as if the outcomes were real. The mind becomes invested in events that have not occurred and may never occur. This investment consumes attention and emotional energy. From an evolutionary perspective, this is inefficient. Energy spent on imagined scenarios does not improve immediate survival. Yet the brain has no mechanism to limit this investment once abstraction becomes dominant. The mind treats abstract concerns as if they were concrete threats or opportunities. This leads to persistent mental engagement without proportional benefit. Over time, abstraction reshapes the baseline state of the mind. Instead of responding to the present moment, the brain orients itself toward representations of the future or interpretations of the past. The present becomes secondary. Attention drifts easily because it is constantly pulled by imagined scenarios. This drift is not a failure of focus. Importantly, evolution never refined a system for balancing abstract thought with rest. The environments in which the mind evolved did not demand such balance. Abstract thinking was a rare tool, not a constant condition. As a result, modern humans experience a mind that is always working, even when nothing requires immediate action. This constant engagement produces a subtle form of stress. The mind remains alert, scanning abstract space for problems to solve. Many of these problems have no clear solution or require no immediate action. The brain does not recognize this distinction. It continues to invest effort. This is where abstraction begins to feel like a burden rather than a gift. The mind becomes preoccupied with representations instead of experiences. It carries mental models that demand maintenance, revision, and protection. Over time, this maintenance becomes exhausting. The cost is not always obvious. It appears as difficulty resting, difficulty focusing on simple tasks, or a sense that the mind is never fully at ease. Understanding abstraction as a trade-off rather than a pure advantage reveals why this capacity contributes to mental strain. It was never meant to dominate consciousness. It was meant to serve specific purposes and then recede. Modern life prevents that retreat. As abstract thinking becomes constant, the human mind begins to confuse possibility with necessity. The brain evolved to imagine potential outcomes in order to prepare for immediate action. When abstraction was rare, imagined scenarios served a clear purpose. They helped anticipate danger or opportunity in the near future. Once the situation passed, the simulation ended. In modern life, abstraction has no natural endpoint. The mind continuously generates possibilities, many of which require no action at all. Yet the brain treats them as if they were obligations. Each imagined outcome carries a sense of urgency, even when nothing can be done. This creates a subtle but persistent pressure. The mind feels responsible for managing an endless field of potential futures. From an evolutionary perspective, this is a misuse of cognitive resources. The brain was not designed to manage long chains of hypothetical events. It was designed to respond to immediate conditions. When it is forced to operate in a landscape of constant possibility, it becomes strained. This strain manifests as difficulty prioritizing. The mind cannot easily decide which thoughts matter and which can be ignored. Everything feels potentially important because abstraction removes clear markers of relevance. In concrete environments, relevance was signaled by proximity and intensity. A nearby threat demanded attention. A distant one did not. Abstract problems do not follow these rules. They can feel urgent regardless of distance in time or space. The brain lacks a reliable filter for such information. As a result, attention becomes fragmented. The mind jumps between concerns without resolving any of them. This fragmentation is often interpreted as distraction or lack of discipline. In reality, it reflects a system overwhelmed by competing representations. Another cost of abstraction is its effect on emotional regulation. Abstract thinking extends emotional responses beyond their natural duration. A concrete event produces a response that rises and falls with the event. An abstract event can be revisited repeatedly through thought. Each revisit reactivates emotion. The brain experiences this as ongoing engagement. Emotional systems remain partially active, waiting for closure. Because many abstract concerns cannot be resolved through action, closure does not arrive. This leads to prolonged emotional arousal without resolution. Over time, the baseline emotional state of the mind shifts. Calm becomes harder to access. Not because the environment is threatening, but because thought continually reintroduces threat signals. The brain does not differentiate between a real event and a simulated one when assigning emotional weight. Both activate similar pathways. Evolution did not refine a mechanism to suppress emotion in response to imagined scenarios because such scenarios were rare in ancestral life. Modern abstraction overwhelms this system. The mind becomes emotionally engaged with events that exist only as representations. This engagement feels meaningful, but it drains energy. Another limitation appears in how abstraction interacts with meaning. Humans often search for meaning through thought. They analyze experiences, compare possibilities, and evaluate outcomes. Abstract thinking allows this analysis to extend indefinitely. The mind can always imagine a better alternative or a different path. This undermines satisfaction. Any present state can be contrasted with an imagined improvement. The brain treats these contrasts as information rather than speculation. It interprets dissatisfaction as a signal to continue searching. This search has no natural endpoint because abstract space is infinite. In ancestral contexts, meaning was embedded in survival and social roles. There was little need to evaluate alternatives. Modern abstraction removes these anchors. The mind becomes responsible for generating meaning internally. This responsibility weighs heavily on a system not designed for it. The result is a persistent sense that something is missing, even when basic needs are met. Understanding this cost clarifies why abstract thinking, while powerful, often leads to dissatisfaction rather than fulfillment. It is not because abstraction is flawed, but because it is used far beyond the conditions under which it evolved. The final cost of abstract thinking appears when the mind loses its sense of proportion. In a world of direct experience, importance was clear. Physical danger outweighed inconvenience. Hunger outweighed curiosity. The brain evolved to rank concerns according to their impact on survival. Abstract thought disrupts this hierarchy. When the mind operates primarily in symbolic space, it struggles to distinguish between levels of consequence. A minor future possibility can feel as heavy as an immediate need. A distant concern can occupy as much attention as a present one. The brain responds to both with similar intensity because abstraction removes the physical cues that once guided prioritization. This flattening of importance leads to a constant sense of being overwhelmed. Everything feels significant, and nothing can be easily dismissed. From an evolutionary perspective, this is a failure of scale rather than intelligence. The brain's ranking systems were calibrated for environments where signals were concrete and limited. Modern abstraction presents an endless stream of signals without clear boundaries. The mind attempts to process them all because it cannot reliably determine which can be ignored. This effort is unsustainable. Over time, mental energy becomes diluted, attention is spread thin, and depth of engagement decreases. The mind feels busy but unproductive, active but unsatisfied. Another effect of this loss of proportion is the erosion of rest. Rest, in evolutionary terms, was enforced by the environment. Darkness, cold, and physical fatigue limited activity. Abstract thought bypasses these limits. The mind can continue working even when the body stops. Sleep becomes difficult not because the body is unsafe, but because the mind remains occupied with symbolic concerns. The brain does not recognize that these concerns can wait. This creates a state where rest feels undeserved or incomplete. The mind remains alert, scanning abstract space for resolution. Over long periods, this disrupts the natural rhythm of engagement and disengagement. The brain remains partially activated, even during rest. This chronic activation does not produce clarity, it produces fatigue. Importantly, abstraction also changes how humans relate to limits. In concrete environments, limits were visible and unavoidable. The body could only travel so far, resources were finite. Abstract thinking allows limits to be imagined away. Possibilities feel endless. The mind becomes oriented toward optimization rather than sufficiency. It asks not whether something is enough, but whether it could be better. This orientation was not selected for in evolutionary terms. Survival required adequacy, not perfection. The drive to optimize emerges from abstraction without natural constraints. It keeps the mind engaged indefinitely. Satisfaction becomes temporary because any outcome can be compared to an imagined alternative. This comparison does not improve survival or well-being. It simply maintains mental activity. The brain treats this activity as useful because it resembles problem-solving. Yet many of the problems it generates cannot be solved through thought alone. They require acceptance, limitation, or rest responses that abstraction does not naturally support. This reveals the final aspect of abstraction as a trade-off. It expands the range of what humans can imagine, but it also expands the range of what the mind feels responsible for managing. The brain was never designed to carry such breadth continuously. It evolved to engage deeply with a narrow set of immediate concerns, then disengage. Modern abstraction prevents disengagement. Understanding this completes the fifth axis. It shows that abstract thinking, while central to human achievement, carries inherent costs when it becomes the dominant mode of experience. The mind was not meant to live permanently in representation. It was meant to return, again and again, to the limits of the present moment. The conflict between the human mind and the human body becomes more visible as modern life separates their rhythms. The body remains governed by biological cycles shaped over millions of years. Sleep, hunger, movement, and recovery follow patterns that evolved in response to daylight, physical exertion, and environmental constraint. These rhythms are slow, repetitive, and predictable. The mind, however, has been pulled into a different tempo. It operates within social time rather than biological time. Schedules, deadlines, expectations, and symbolic goals impose a pace that does not align with the body's natural signals. This divergence creates tension. The body communicates through sensation and fatigue. The mind communicates through thought and anticipation. When these signals conflict, the mind often overrides the body. From an evolutionary perspective, this override was rare. Physical limits enforced rest. Exhaustion could not be ignored for long because survival depended on bodily function. In modern environments, physical demands are reduced while cognitive demands increase. The body may signal the need for rest, but the mind remains engaged with abstract concerns. This engagement keeps stress systems active. preventing full recovery. Over time, the body accumulates fatigue without the mind recognizing it as urgent. The mind continues to plan, evaluate, and simulate even as physical systems strain. This imbalance does not immediately produce illness. It produces a subtle sense of disconnection. People often describe feeling tired but unable to rest, or resting without feeling restored. This experience reflects a mismatch between biological need and cognitive activity. It evolved as part of a system where physical state strongly influenced mental state. Hunger sharpened attention. Fatigue reduced activity. Darkness signaled withdrawal. Modern life weakens these signals. Artificial light extends waking hours. Climate control removes environmental pressure. Sedentary behavior reduces physical feedback. The body becomes quieter, while the mind becomes louder. This inversion is significant. In ancestral contexts, bodily signals dominated awareness. Mental activity followed physical demand. In modern contexts, mental demand often dominates, suppressing bodily cues. The mind treats the body as a support system rather than a guide. This reordering has consequences. When the body's signals are ignored, they intensify. Fatigue becomes chronic. Tension accumulates. Sleep becomes fragmented. The mind interprets these changes as problems to solve rather than signals to heed. It responds with more planning, more control, and more abstraction. This response deepens the imbalance. The body requires reduction and release, while the mind applies effort and analysis. From an evolutionary standpoint, this pattern is unsustainable. Biological systems rely on cycles of activation and recovery. Without recovery, efficiency declines. Yet the mind does not naturally reduce its activity in response to bodily fatigue. It lacks a built-in mechanism to translate physical signals into cognitive restraint. Evolution did not provide such a mechanism because the environment enforced restraint automatically. When the body reached its limit, activity stopped. Modern conditions remove this enforcement. The mind continues to operate as if physical resources were infinite. This reveals a core aspect of the failed design. The human mind can function independently of the body's immediate state, but it was never meant to do so for long. The separation of mind and body rhythm creates a form of quiet conflict. The body seeks restoration, the mind seeks resolution. These goals are not always compatible. Understanding this conflict sets the stage for examining how prolonged imbalance affects both mental clarity and physical well-being. It shows that the strain many people feel is not located solely in the mind or the body, but in the growing distance between how each evolved to function together. As the mind continues to override the body's signals, another limitation becomes apparent. The brain does not experience fatigue in the same way the body does. Physical exhaustion produces clear sensations, weakness, pain, slowed movement that demand rest. Mental fatigue is quieter. It accumulates without a distinct signal, often disguising itself as restlessness or lack of motivation. In ancestral environments, this difference mattered little. Physical exhaustion usually preceded mental overload. When the body stopped, the mind followed. In modern life, the order is reversed. The body can remain physically inactive, while the mind remains intensely active. This decoupling allows mental effort to extend far beyond healthy limits. The brain continues to process, evaluate, and simulate even when its efficiency declines. Because there is no sharp signal indicating mental exhaustion, the mind rarely stops on its own. Instead, it shifts quality. Thought becomes repetitive rather than creative. Attention becomes narrow rather than flexible. Yet the brain interprets this not as a need for rest, but as a need for greater effort. This misinterpretation deepens fatigue. The mind pushes harder at the very moment it should withdraw. Another aspect of this imbalance lies in how recovery is understood. The body recovers through reduction of activity. Muscles rebuild during rest. Hormonal systems recalibrate during sleep. The mind, however, often attempts to recover through stimulation. It seeks distraction, novelty, or information, believing these will provide relief. This strategy can temporarily mask fatigue, but it does not restore cognitive balance. The brain remains engaged, merely shifting focus. True mental recovery requires disengagement, a state the mind does not naturally enter without environmental cues. In ancestral settings, disengagement was enforced by darkness, isolation, and physical stillness. Modern environments rarely provide these conditions. Light extends waking hours. Devices supply endless content. Social expectations reward constant availability. The mind remains open, receptive, and active. Over time, this prevents full recovery. The body may sleep, but the mind does not fully power down. Sleep becomes shallow. Rest becomes incomplete. The individual wakes feeling mentally tired despite physical rest. This experience is often misunderstood as a personal failure to relax. In reality, it reflects a design limitation. The brain evolved to follow the body's lead into rest. When the body no longer clearly leads, the mind continues forward. Another consequence of prolonged imbalance is the blurring of internal signals. The body communicates needs through subtle changes, slight hunger, mild fatigue, tension. When these signals are repeatedly overridden, sensitivity decreases. The individual becomes less aware of physical state. The mind dominates awareness. This loss of bodily feedback further weakens regulation. Without clear signals, the brain cannot adjust behavior appropriately. It continues to operate at a high level, assuming resources remain available. This assumption is false, but the brain lacks direct access to the body's limits. Evolution never required such access. Physical constraint was external and unavoidable. Modern life internalizes constraint, making it easier to ignore. Over long periods, this pattern produces a state where the mind feels constantly active and the body feels persistently drained. Neither system fully resets. The individual exists in a middle state, not fully engaged, not fully at rest. It is a byproduct of separating cognitive demand from physical reality. Recognizing this helps explain why many modern approaches to rest fail. They address the body without disengaging the mind, or they stimulate the mind while claiming to offer relief. The underlying issue is not effort, but alignment. The mind and body evolved to regulate each other through shared rhythms. When those rhythms diverge, both systems suffer quietly. Understanding this divergence clarifies why rest has become difficult to achieve, and why fatigue often feels mental even when the body has done little. It prepares the ground for examining what happens when this imbalance persists across years, shaping how humans relate to effort, recovery, and the idea of rest itself. When the separation between mind and body persists over time, it begins to shape how humans relate to effort itself. The mind develops an expectation of continuous engagement, while the body becomes a resource to be managed rather than a system to be listened to. This shift is subtle. It does not arrive as pain or collapse, but as normalization. Constant mental activity starts to feel ordinary. Periods of stillness feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. The brain interprets disengagement as loss of control rather than recovery. From an evolutionary perspective, this interpretation is inverted. Rest once increased survival by conserving energy and reducing exposure. In modern contexts, rest lacks visible reward. Productivity, responsiveness, and optimization are valued more highly. The mind adapts to these values, reinforcing its own activity. It treats effort as safety and stillness as risk. This creates a feedback loop. The more the mind stays active, the less tolerance it has for inactivity. The body signals fatigue, but the mind reframes it as resistance to be overcome. Over time, This reframing weakens the body's influence on behavior. The individual becomes skilled at functioning while depleted. This skill is often praised, but it carries hidden costs. Biological systems rely on variation. Muscles require cycles of use and repair. Neural systems require periods of reduced input to recalibrate. When effort becomes constant, recovery becomes incomplete. The body adapts by lowering its baseline capacity. Energy becomes limited not because of effort itself, but because recovery never fully occurs. The mind experiences this as a vague sense of limitation rather than exhaustion. Motivation declines. Focus becomes harder to sustain, yet the mind responds by increasing pressure rather than reducing demand. This response deepens the imbalance. Another consequence of prolonged misalignment is the distortion of time perception. When the mind is constantly engaged, time feels compressed. Days blend together. Rest does not create clear boundaries. The body's slower rhythms are overridden by cognitive pacing. In ancestral environments, time was marked by physical change, movement, light, temperature. These markers helped regulate effort and rest. Modern life weakens these cues. The mind fills the gap with internal scheduling. Time becomes something to manage rather than something to inhabit. This management requires constant attention. The brain remains oriented toward what comes next. The present moment loses depth. Rest, when it occurs, feels shallow because the mind continues to anticipate future demands. This anticipation keeps stress systems partially active, even in the absence of immediate tasks. Importantly, the brain has no internal alarm to signal that this state is harmful. Evolution did not need such an alarm because prolonged separation between mental demand and physical recovery was rare. The environment enforced balance. Modern conditions remove that enforcement. The mind continues to operate under the assumption that sustained effort is adaptive. The body absorbs the cost. Over long periods, this cost appears as chronic fatigue, reduced resilience, and diminished capacity for restoration. These outcomes are often treated as personal shortcomings or lifestyle failures. They are neither. They reflect a system operating beyond its design parameters. The human mind was built to coordinate action with physical state. When that coordination is lost, both systems degrade quietly. This realization completes the sixth axis. It shows that the failed design of the mind is not an isolated cognitive issue. It is embedded in the relationship between thought and flesh. The mind's independence from bodily rhythm allowed human societies to advance rapidly. It also created conditions where internal balance became difficult to maintain. Understanding this prepares the ground for the next axis, where we examine whether this imbalance can be corrected or whether it represents a permanent condition of modern human life. After tracing the limits of memory, abstraction, and the separation between mind and body, a deeper question emerges. Can this design be corrected at all? Modern culture often assumes that any problem can be fixed through better techniques, better habits, or better knowledge. This assumption itself reflects the logic of the human mind. The brain approaches discomfort as a problem to solve. It searches for methods, frameworks, and optimizations. Yet this approach may be misapplied when the source of discomfort lies in evolutionary structure rather than individual behavior. The human mind did not evolve with the expectation that it would need to repair itself. It evolved to respond, not to redesign. From an evolutionary standpoint, there was no pressure to create a mind that could recognize its own limitations and correct them. Survival depended on external adaptation, not internal modification. When conditions changed, populations adapted slowly over generations, not within individual lifetimes. Modern humans, however, live in environments that change faster than biology can follow. The mind responds to this mismatch by attempting internal solutions. It tries to regulate itself through thought. This effort produces techniques for focus, calm, and control. Some of these techniques provide temporary relief. They help reduce symptoms, manage attention, or soften emotional response. But they do not alter the underlying design. The brain remains a system optimized for short-term survival operating in a long-term abstract world. Expecting permanent correction may itself be part of the problem. Another limitation becomes visible when the mind attempts self-repair. The same cognitive systems that generate distress are recruited to resolve it. Thought is used to manage thought. This creates a loop. The mind analyzes its own activity, seeking the right configuration that will produce lasting ease. Each attempt reinforces self-monitoring. The brain becomes more aware of its own processes, not less. While awareness can be valuable, constant self-observation increases cognitive load. The mind remains active, even when the goal is rest. This paradox reveals a boundary the brain cannot easily cross. It cannot step outside itself to redesign its core functions. It can only rearrange how it uses them. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is a limit of any system attempting to modify itself from within. In ancestral environments, this limit was irrelevant. There was no expectation that the mind should be comfortable or balanced at all times. Discomfort signaled danger, effort, or change. It served a purpose. Modern expectations differ. Comfort, clarity, and sustained well-being are treated as standards rather than temporary states. The mind interprets deviation from these standards as failure. It works harder to correct itself. This effort increases strain. From an evolutionary perspective, the idea of a permanently calm mind is unusual. The brain evolved to remain responsive, not settled. Responsiveness kept organisms alive. Stillness increased vulnerability. This ancient logic remains embedded in neural systems. Attempts to eliminate mental activity entirely often conflict with this logic. The brain resists. It interprets complete disengagement as loss of readiness. This resistance is not a flaw to overcome. It is a feature to be understood. Recognizing this shifts the question. Instead of asking how to fix the human mind, it becomes more useful to ask how to live with its constraints. This does not mean resignation. It means realism. Understanding the limits of design allows expectations to change. The mind may never become perfectly aligned with modern life. It may never offer sustained ease. But it can be placed in contexts that reduce friction. This perspective marks the beginning of the seventh axis. It moves the discussion away from correction and toward accommodation. It asks whether peace comes not from repairing the mind, but from understanding what it was never meant to do. When the idea of fixing the human mind begins to dissolve, another perspective becomes possible: adaptation without correction. Rather than attempting to change the structure of thought, humans have historically altered their environments, rhythms, and expectations to reduce friction with their mental design. This pattern appears repeatedly across human history. Long before modern psychology, cultures developed practices that limited mental overload without directly addressing cognition. Rituals structured time, traditions reduced choice, repetition created predictability. These were not tools for self-improvement in the modern sense. They were ways of shaping life so the mind did not have to manage everything on its own. From an evolutionary standpoint, this approach makes sense. The mind evolved to function within structured environments. It relied on external cues to regulate activity. When those cues were present, internal strain was reduced. Modern life removes many of these structures. Roles blur. The mind inherits responsibilities that were once distributed across environment, culture, and routine. This transfer increases cognitive load. The brain is forced to decide, evaluate, and monitor constantly. It treats this responsibility as necessary, but it was never designed to carry it indefinitely. Recognizing this shifts the focus from internal control to external alignment. Instead of asking how to quiet the mind, the question becomes how to create conditions where the mind has less to process. This does not require complex techniques. It often involves reduction rather than addition, fewer decisions, slower transitions, clear boundaries between activity and rest. These changes do not alter the brain, but they alter how much the brain must do. Importantly, the mind often resists this approach. It interprets reduction as loss. Less information feels like ignorance. Less stimulation feels like emptiness. This resistance reflects the brain's orientation toward vigilance. It prefers to remain engaged, even when engagement is unnecessary. Over time, however, environments that reduce cognitive demand allow natural rhythms to reassert themselves. Attention settles not because it is forced, but because there is less competing input. Another implication of this perspective is the role of acceptance. Acceptance is often misunderstood as passivity. In this context, it means acknowledging design limits without treating them as personal flaws. The mind's tendency toward restlessness, repetition, and abstraction is not something to be eliminated. It is something to be accounted for. The brain no longer needs to resolve an imagined failure. This shift alone can reduce mental strain. The mind works best when it is not tasked with becoming something else. Evolution did not prepare humans to live in constant self-improvement mode. It prepared them to respond to immediate conditions. Constant evaluation of internal state adds an extra layer of demand. Removing that layer creates space. This does not produce constant calm. It produces intervals of ease. From an evolutionary perspective, intervals are enough. Sustained equilibrium was never required. Another aspect of adaptation involves redefining success. Modern culture often equates mental clarity with productivity and emotional stability with control. These standards reflect modern values, not biological ones. The human mind fluctuates, attention wanders, emotion rises and falls. Expecting consistency contradicts how the brain operates. When fluctuation is accepted as normal, variability becomes less threatening. The mind no longer interprets change as failure. This reduces the impulse to correct and optimize continuously. Over time, this reduces cognitive load. The brain spends less energy evaluating itself and more energy responding to what is present. This completes the second movement of the seventh axis. It suggests that relief does not come from redesigning the mind, but from redesigning how life interacts with it. The question shifts again toward whether such adaptation is sufficient in a world that continues to accelerate. This leads naturally to the final part of this axis, where the limits of accommodation are examined. Even when humans adapt their environments and expectations, a final limit remains. The world itself does not slow down. Technological, social, and informational acceleration continues regardless of individual adjustment. This exposes the boundary of accommodation. While it is possible to reduce friction between mind and life, it is not possible to fully restore the conditions under which the mind evolved. The brain remains embedded in a world that operates on abstract time, constant comparison, and continuous demand. This reality forces a deeper recognition. Some degree of mental strain may be unavoidable, not because humans are failing to adapt, but because adaptation itself has limits. From an evolutionary perspective, this is not surprising. Evolution produces systems that are good enough, not systems optimized for every possible environment. The human mind was good enough for survival across a wide range of ancestral conditions. It was not optimized for perpetual acceleration. Expecting it to function without friction in such conditions may be unrealistic. This recognition challenges modern assumptions about well-being. Many approaches promise lasting peace, clarity, or control. These promises reflect a belief that the mind can be brought into stable alignment with any environment. The evolutionary view suggests otherwise. Stability was never a constant feature of mental life. Responsiveness was. Fluctuation was normal. Periods of tension and release alternated naturally. Modern acceleration compresses these cycles, leaving little room for release. Even with conscious effort, complete balance may remain out of reach. This does not render adaptation meaningless. It reframes its purpose. The goal shifts from eliminating strain to managing it. Understanding the limits of design allows humans to place strain in context. Mental discomfort becomes a signal of misalignment rather than personal deficiency. This perspective reduces secondary suffering, the distress caused by believing something is wrong internally. When strain is expected, it loses some of its power. The mind no longer needs to solve itself. It can simply respond. Another implication of this limit is the role of choice. While the world accelerates, individuals still make decisions about exposure, rhythm, and priority. These decisions do not fix the mind, but they influence how often it is pushed beyond its range. Small adjustments accumulate. Moments of reduction create spaces of recovery. Evolution did not require continuous comfort. It required recovery sufficient to continue functioning. In this sense, accommodation does not aim for perfection. It aims for sustainability. Recognizing that the mind cannot be permanently settled allows effort to be directed more realistically. Instead of seeking final answers, humans learn to notice cycles. Effort rises, rest follows, attention narrows. It opens again. This cyclical view aligns more closely with biological reality. It accepts impermanence rather than resisting it. This acceptance does not resolve all discomfort, but it reduces conflict. The mind no longer fights its own nature. This realization completes the seventh axis. It acknowledges that the failed design is not something to be corrected or transcended. It is something to be lived with. Understanding its limits allows for a different kind of stability, one that does not depend on eliminating tension, but on moving through it with awareness. This prepares the ground for the final axis, where the focus shifts from analysis to a broader reflection on what it means to live well with a mind that was never finished. At this point, the question is no longer whether the human mind is a failed design, but what it means to live with a design that was never completed. Evolution does not produce finished systems. It produces workable ones, shaped by pressure and chance rather than intention. The human mind reflects this process. It carries layers built at different times for different purposes. Some layers respond to immediate danger. Others support memory, language, and abstraction. These layers were never meant to operate together in a stable, modern environment. They coexist without full integration. This lack of integration creates tension, but it also creates flexibility. The mind is not optimized, but it is adaptable. Understanding this changes how failure is interpreted. It means incompleteness. The mind was not designed to offer a final state of clarity or peace. It was designed to keep responding. From an evolutionary perspective, a mind that settled completely would be vulnerable. Openness, restlessness, and sensitivity kept humans alert to change. These traits were costly, but they increased survival across uncertain environments. Yet the traits themselves remain neutral. They are neither flaws nor virtues. They are conditions. Living well with such a mind does not require eliminating its activity. It requires understanding its tendencies and choosing how to relate to them. One of the most important shifts involves how attention is directed. The human mind naturally drifts toward threat, comparison, and anticipation. This drift is not a mistake. It reflects survival priorities. When these priorities dominate awareness, life feels narrow and pressured. When attention is gently redirected toward immediate experience, the mind does not stop working, but it changes quality. Sensory input anchors awareness in the present moment, reducing the dominance of abstract simulation. This does not fix the mind. It places it back into a context it understands. Another shift involves redefining identity. Modern culture encourages identification with thought, achievement, and internal narrative. The evolutionary view suggests a looser relationship. Thoughts are events, not definitions. Emotions are signals, not verdicts. When identity becomes less entangled with mental content, fluctuations lose their urgency. The mind can move without dragging the self with it. This separation does not require constant effort. It emerges from understanding. The brain responds differently when its signals are no longer interpreted as absolute. Over time, this understanding softens reactivity. It does not eliminate it, but it reduces its grip. Another aspect of living with an unfinished mind is accepting rhythm. Mental states change. Focus rises and falls. Calm appears and disappears. Expecting continuity creates friction. Accepting rhythm reduces it. Evolution favored systems that oscillated rather than stabilized. Modern expectations often reverse this logic. They seek consistency. Returning to a rhythmic view aligns expectations with biology. This alignment reduces the sense of failure when states shift. It allows rest to be recognized as part of function rather than a deviation from it. This first part of the final axis does not offer a solution. It reframes the question. Living well with the human mind is not about reaching a final state. It is about learning how to move within limits without constant resistance. This perspective opens space for a quieter relationship with thought, memory, and effort. It prepares the way for the final movement, where the focus turns toward meaning, not as a goal to be achieved, but as something that emerges naturally when the mind is no longer treated as a problem to be solved. Meaning is often imagined as something the mind must discover, construct, or secure. The brain assumes that if something is important, it must be defined, named, and understood. Life was structured around survival, relationship, and repetition. Purpose emerged naturally from participation rather than reflection. The mind did not need to ask what life meant. It needed to respond to what life demanded. Modern life reverses this order. Many basic demands are met, leaving the mind without clear external direction. It turns inward, searching for meaning through thought. This search often becomes restless because abstraction offers no final answer. Any meaning constructed through thought can be questioned, compared, or replaced. The mind continues searching, not because meaning is absent, but because it is approached as a concept rather than an experience. From an evolutionary perspective, meaning was never meant to be permanent or universal. It was situational. It arose from doing what was necessary in a given moment. When the mind releases the expectation of a final explanation, meaning can return to this simpler form. It appears in engagement rather than evaluation. This does not require special insight. It requires allowing attention to settle on what is present without demanding interpretation. The unfinished design of the human mind means that many questions remain unanswered. The brain naturally resists this. It prefers closure. In ancestral settings, closure often arrived through action. A threat was faced. A task was completed. In modern life, many questions have no clear resolution. The mind continues to circle them. When uncertainty is treated as failure, this circling becomes distressing. When uncertainty is recognized as a natural condition, the pressure eases. The brain no longer needs to resolve everything. It can coexist with what is unknown. This coexistence does not produce indifference. It produces flexibility. The mind remains responsive without becoming consumed. Another aspect of meaning emerges through limitation. Modern abstraction encourages the idea that life should be maximized. More understanding, more achievement, more control. Limitation was always part of human life. Resources were finite. Time was uncertain. Accepting limitation reduced wasteful effort. When limitation is acknowledged, attention narrows naturally. What remains becomes more vivid. Meaning arises from focus rather than expansion. This does not diminish life. It clarifies it. The mind no longer needs to manage endless possibility. It can engage deeply with what is available. This engagement does not eliminate discomfort, but it grounds experience. Over time, this grounding reduces the mind's tendency to drift into abstraction. Another consequence of this shift is a gentler relationship with time. Instead of treating time as something to fill or optimize, it is experienced as something that passes. The mind relaxes its grip. Moments are not required to justify themselves. This orientation aligns with the brain's original function. The mind evolved to respond to change, not to accumulate achievement. When this orientation returns, effort becomes more selective. Attention becomes less scattered. This does not create constant peace. It creates moments of ease within fluctuation. This second part of the final axis suggests that meaning is not something the human mind must solve. It is something that emerges when the mind is allowed to function within its limits. When the pressure to complete the unfinished design is released, life no longer feels like a task to be perfected. It becomes a process to be inhabited. This prepares the way for the final movement, where the focus shifts from meaning to value, and from explanation to a quiet question that remains open. In the end, the question of whether the human mind is a failed design does not require a definitive answer. Evolution never asked that question. It did not aim for completion, balance, or comfort. It aimed for continuation. The human mind exists because it worked well enough, long enough, under conditions that no longer define modern life. The discomfort many people feel is not evidence that something has gone wrong. It is evidence that something has changed. When this is understood, the relationship with the mind becomes quieter. There is less urgency to correct it, and less pressure to extract final meaning from it. The mind no longer needs to justify itself. It can simply function as it is. This does not remove uncertainty. It places it in context. Uncertainty becomes part of the human condition rather than a problem to eliminate. From an evolutionary perspective, living with uncertainty was always normal. What is new is the expectation that uncertainty should be resolved internally and permanently. Letting go of that expectation reduces a great deal of unnecessary strain. Another shift occurs in how value is understood. Value does not need to be discovered through analysis or defended through achievement. It emerges through engagement with the present conditions of life. Simple actions regain weight. Rest regains legitimacy. Attention no longer has to be productive to be worthwhile. These changes are subtle. They do not transform the mind into something else. They allow it to return, at times, to a mode it understands. This return is temporary. The mind will wander again. It will abstract, remember, anticipate, and evaluate. That is its nature. The difference lies in how these movements are interpreted. When wandering is no longer treated as failure, it loses its edge. When restlessness is no longer treated as a flaw, it becomes easier to rest. The mind does not need to be finished to be lived with. It needs to be understood. Understanding does not silence thought. It changes the relationship to it. Over time, this relationship becomes less confrontational. The mind stops being an obstacle and becomes a companion with limits. This companionship is imperfect, but it is sufficient. Evolution did not promise peace. It offered continuity. Modern life asks more of the mind than it was built to give. Recognizing this does not solve the tension. It softens it. Softening is not resolution. It is accommodation. It allows life to proceed without constant resistance. As this series comes to a close, no conclusion is offered in the traditional sense. There is no technique, no final insight, no promise of lasting calm. That absence is intentional. The human mind does not arrive at endings. It moves through states. The most honest way to end is to leave space rather than fill it. So the question remains, not as a problem to solve, but as something to rest beside. If the human mind was never meant to be complete, and never meant to be at ease for long, then what does it mean to live well with a mind that continues to wander, question, and remain unfinished?